Welcome to the Intimate Marriage Podcast, where I teach educated, successful couples how to have incredible, passionate relationships so that you can stop compromising and start feeling fully alive in your relationship. I'm Alexandra Stockwell, aka the Intimacy Doctor. I'm a physician, a relationship and intimacy coach, and I'm an intimate marriage expert. My husband and I have been married for 26 years. We have 4 children and full professional lives, and we've created an amazing marriage. I've shown hundreds of couples how to do so as well. So if you want to deepen your understanding of your own relationship and learn to access new heights of emotional, sensual, and erotic intimacy, you're in the right place. I will show you how. Now, let's dive in. How do you think about your role in marriage? I'm going to address some of the really common pitfalls in answering that question. But before I do, I want to thank Aloha Ruth for this beautiful review on iTunes. She wrote, "Thanks to Alexandra and her guests for illuminating the path of soulful relationships." You are most welcome. That is really exactly what I want to do with this podcast. Illuminate the path to soulful relationships, so long as soulful includes emotionally close and sensually and erotically expansive. And I'm guessing it does. So if you are a new listener, welcome. And if you are a returning listener and you haven't yet, please go to wherever you listen to podcasts and leave a rating. And if you listen on iTunes, make sure to leave a review as well, because it helps other listeners know whether or not this is the podcast to listen to and what they'll find. And for me, I just love reading the reviews. They mean a lot. So if you haven't, please go ahead and leave one. And let's return to this question about roles in marriage. Now, I'm not going to say this as someone with historical expertise. I'm just going to say this in broad strokes. But in the past, until relatively recently in human history, as long as marriage has been an institution, there have been very clear purposes for it that do not have to do with pleasure, happiness, personal growth, or marital contexts for expansion and service. Initially, marriage served the function of, well, it was a commercial transaction. 2 fathers deciding what would be best for themselves and their children. There was financial benefit to getting married for one of the fathers anyway. I think, most typically you get a woman and you get cash. What could be better? And in aristocratic circles, of course, it prevented wars. When 2 feuding nations had children who married, that created peace. In other words, politics, finances, prestige, standing, practicality, these were all driving motivators in marriage. And as I said, I'm not a historical expert. I don't know when that began to change. Sometime presumably in the 20th century, maybe a bit earlier. But anyway, now we have completely different expectations. And intimate relationship is a vehicle for personal growth, for fulfillment, companionship, friendship, and reflection, seeing the parts of yourselves that are undeveloped and really need attention, need nurturing from you so that you can be more present, so that you can be your best self. You get the idea. And when this is what we want from marriage, both stability and security and companionship, as well as pleasure and erotic fulfillment and closeness and connection and intimacy of so many different flavors. When we want some blend of that, there are two very common unhelpful archetypes that we lean into. And an archetype is the kind of energy and identity and role that each of us inhabits. And there are many different archetypes. We can be a queen, we can be a king, we can be a servant, a martyr, a slut, a goddess, a warrior, a jester, a provider. All of these are archetypes. And there are two extremely common archetypes that people fall into when wanting an intimate marriage. The kind of marriage that is available in modern times where you choose whom you're going to marry and you can make it something truly extraordinary. So what are the two archetypes that people fall into that really don't serve in creating an intimate marriage, that really ultimately function to create disconnection? The ones I want to talk about are the ones where you essentially become a child and you want your spouse to be the parent who cares for you, who rescues you emotionally or financially or any other way. Now, everything that I'm going to say, the same situation can happen in a way that is mature, collaborative, sexy, intimate, and growth-oriented. For example, deciding where to live or doing the dishes after dinner. Those are things that can happen in the way I just said, where it's a really positive and fruitful, connected process. And they can also happen if you feel like a child and your parent makes the big decisions and you want them to make sure your needs are met without even necessarily saying what they are. Okay, so that's one. And then the other archetype I want to talk about is the spouse who functions as a project manager. So I'm going to dive into each of them separately. And let me just say that when you are in a parent-child dynamic, I suppose you could role play it in a sexual context. But other than that, the parent-child dynamic just erodes passion. It's not sexy. The parent-child dynamic doesn't contain erotic energy. And if you are interacting with your spouse as the child, that is eventually going to erode the erotic energy as well. What do I mean functioning as a child? I mean wanting your spouse to know what you want and need without really saying so. Wanting to be rescued when things are tough. Wanting them to be available for you to put a head on their shoulder 100% of the time. And if they're not fully available to you, you feel rejected. Feeling entitled to their attention and affection. Becoming annoyed when they're not behaving in the way that you want them to. All of these are hallmarks of being a child. In fact, if I'm saying all of this in somewhat amplified terms, but if you tend to go in this direction, but maybe, lower volume, one of the questions you can ask yourself when you're with your spouse or you're feeling these ways is, how old do you feel? Because probably you don't actually feel your biological age. I know when my husband and I first got married, I felt like we were playing house. It reminded me a little bit of the way that, let's say, 2 or 3 or 4-year-old children will put on their parents' shoes and walk around. It's like they love wearing those shoes and they so obviously don't fit them, except they do because they're wearing them and it's charming. That's how I felt when we first got married, and even a little bit our first family holidays with children. I felt like I was playing grown up. It just was a real house with a real mortgage. And here I am, 55 years old, married for 27 years, and every now and then I don't feel like I'm playing dress up or pretending to be a grown-up. I don't feel that way. But my husband knows me well, and we have been through a lot of peeling back the layers and revealing what's underneath. And so when I start whining a little bit, I'm actually very proud to say this. It used to happen more often. I can't think of when it last did, but I'm sure it's happened at least once in the last year. I'm guessing, certainly in the last 3 years, where he will say, "How old do you feel?" And I used to, kind of like a rebellious teenager, just hate it and be annoyed. But I realize he's being kind. He's showing me something. And most of the time, I grow up when I hear that. And every now and then I'll say, "I feel about 6 years old, and would you please just be with me as a 6-year-old?" But as I'm asking for that, that already means that I'm aware of being older. I am more mature, and it's not as irresponsible. It's actually my desire. Would you please nurture me and just be gentle with me as though I were 6 years old? But most of the time when he says, "How old are you feeling?" or I ask myself, "How old do I feel?" it is so helpful to realize I am in the landscape of being young in a way that was great when I was a kid. And it's important to know that that's going on inside me, but that is not the kind of presence or way of being which is ever going to really nurture my relationship with my husband in the ways that I, as a mature woman, definitely desire. Okay, so that's one of the archetypes people tend to fall into, and it can be very sneaky and unconscious. So as I said, I've put it in Technicolor. I've dialed up the volume. But if there's any small tendency in that you recognize in yourself as you listen, it's definitely worth exploring that. And how are you going to explore it? Well, just start with journaling or just freely thinking if you don't like to write, and see what comes up for you. Because all of us have some aspect inside us from our childhood that can pop up when we feel unsafe or triggered or unseen or hurt in some way. And so if that's your mode of interacting with your husband, it is blocking the kind of connection that creates an intimate marriage. So you want to evolve from that, which is absolutely possible. That I don't ever talk about this in the Aligned in Hot Marriage program, but it definitely contributes to being your fully expressed, uncompromising self, which means not being a child and treating your spouse as the parent. Okay, on the other side, this is especially fascinating when it happens with women. It happens with men too. But if you're a woman listening, I want you to really consider this. If you are successful at work, you have studied, you have accomplished a lot, you run your business, you are a physician or a lawyer or an entrepreneur or someone in the corporate world, you are used to managing people and making things happen, and you have all kinds of talents that you've developed, that you've cultivated, that have really led to your success. And fundamentally, no matter what your actual profession and no matter how wonderful your impact, either directly on people or in supervising people who are creating things in the world, whatever your industry and professional context, you are used to making things happen in a way that has you overseeing things, keeping tabs on things, and intervening as necessary when they're not going in the way that you want them to. I'm going to refer to this phenomenon of the accomplished, ambitious, successful woman as project managing. Obviously, if you are successful, you are not exclusively project managing. You have vision. You have your heart engaged in the meaningfulness of the work you're doing. There's so much more to say, but I want to focus on the part of you, which is a project manager. It is an essential skill. As a business owner myself, I have come to totally appreciate the role of project manager, because no matter how great the idea and how skillful the people who are going to implement it are, without a project manager, the whole thing doesn't really happen, or the parts don't communicate with one another in the way they need to. So I have the utmost respect for project managing. And when you've been working all day, sometimes all night, and you come home, and project managing is the thing that creates success professionally, it's completely understandable that you would employ your project managing attitudes and behaviors in your home. In fact, it works. It gets things done. It contributes to creating rhythms and routines in your household and having people follow them. Your project managing energy is what has people put their shoes away and brush their teeth before going to bed and set the table, clear the table, have homework done, backpacks packed, lunches made for school, or the lawn mowed. Like, your project managing skills in your household, they are needed, they are important, and I respect and honor them. However, the reason I'm talking about project managing in the context of talking about the archetypes that prevent connection in a marriage is because when you treat your spouse as someone you project manage, that also erodes the erotic chemistry. In fact, when I was talking before about being a child in the relationship, if we're thinking of women, it's the archetype is damsel in distress, that if you are that way much of the time, your spouse is not going to be attracted to you, because that energy is not the energy of erotic partnership and building intimacy together. Now, when it comes to being a project manager in your home, your spouse may well be attracted to you and appreciate your power and be fully available to connect. But if you are project managing, it is unlikely that you're going to feel turned on, that you're going to be attracted to your spouse, not because of anything, if I'm going to speak of women, but it goes in the other direction as well. It's not because your husband is any less attractive, any less skillful and responsive in bed, any less devoted to your pleasure. No, you are not going to be attracted because the project managing energy is not the energy of intimate connection. It's the energy of getting things done. And that's not where the erotic juiciness flourishes. It's where it wilts and becomes dehydrated. So in this context of talking about how being a child in your marriage prevents intimate connection, and being a project manager in your marriage prevents intimate connection. In fact, let me just say that as a woman listening, if you have this tendency, I expect you to recognize it. If you're a man with this tendency, you may not be as likely to recognize it because it's a way of being that men are encouraged to embody and rewarded for. And so if you wonder if you project manage your wife, ask her, because I'm pretty sure she's going to know immediately whether or not that's the case. Anyway, both of these prevent the flourishing, intimate connection that is available in a marriage where both people are willing to learn how to create it and are devoted to their own personal growth and collaborative personal growth. But this leads me to a question that one of my loyal listeners asked. He's listened to many podcasts. I believe he reads most or all of my emails, and we've had some very interesting exchanges based on his observations and questions after hearing the things that I've shared, either on my email list, which if you're not on it and you'd like to join, the link is in the show notes. You can just click on that, and I send content that is related to what I share on the podcast, but it's definitely not exactly the same. And so you might enjoy reading that. Anyway, this loyal listener read something that I wrote about connection and how to cultivate it and how to shed blocks which essentially create disconnection. Anyway, he emailed me and said, "What is connection? What do you mean by connection?" And it's a great question. It's actually tender and vulnerable to ask it because connection is not a complicated word in the English language. But what do we really mean by connection? What do I mean anyway? And I told him I would answer the question on a podcast, and I'm choosing to do it in this one because I've described what is not connection, namely being a child in relation to your spouse. You can do that a little bit. Nobody does it all of the time. But if that's your main mode, then I hope you're paying attention. And similarly, if you project manage your spouse, which, by the way, you're much more likely to do when life is busy, and it is so busy for so many people. Anyway, there too, it blocks connection. So what do I mean by connection? Well, this is actually a profound conversation, and this is the beginning of my answer. So often in modern life, when we interact with someone else, there's so much focus on doing. What are we going to do? How are we going to fix it? What are we going to do next? Which movie are we going to watch? What are we going to have for dinner? Even down to when the other person speaks, it is most common that the listener is not relaxed and receiving what they're saying, but instead is actually listening in order to know what they're going to say next, what they're going to respond. In other words, if you're talking to me, I listen, but my attention is on listening in order to know what I say next. And once I know what I'm going to say next, then I need to keep that in the forefront of my mind so I don't forget it, which means there's less attention available to hear what you say. By the way, if that's something you do, I encourage you to have, well, you can pull your phone out as long as you explain what you're doing so it's not offensive to your spouse, or a little notebook. And when you think of things, just write them down so that you're not concerned about forgetting them and you can continue to pay attention to what your spouse is saying. And then you can look at what you've written down and share it when it's your turn to talk. But in any case, we are just so focused on doing. This shows up as well when I first meet someone who's going to become a client or is newly a client. And I say, well, how do you feel? And most often they either say, I don't know, or their response has to do with taking action. Like, well, I feel like I want to think through this problem, or I feel like I just really can't stay here in this moment, or whatever it is. The point is, so much of our consciousness comes through the lens of doing, of being busy, of taking action, of making things happen, of shifting things. Now, all of those are wonderful, but that's not the building block of connection. Even the expression building block, it has to do with building something. It's action-oriented, that image. But what I want to convey is that connection is about being with someone. It's the blossom that opens and turns towards the sun, and there's nothing more to do. It's that feeling during an erotically rich sexual encounter when time stops. In fact, the science of flow does a lot to describe what connection is. It requires you to be at peace with yourself to some degree and at peace with who your partner is in that moment, and just be with it, which means enjoy it, marinate in it, experience it. And as I'm talking, it can sound sometimes like it's a very slow experience and everything's going to slow down and you're not going to get back to making things happen. But the mystery of life is, one of the mysteries of life is that actually when you slow down and you feel connected, and there is the nourishment of being with yourself and your partner, of having your mind and your heart, your soul, your body integrated and present with intention and attention, beautifully blending the moment. It actually nourishes you in a way that fuels you to be more efficient, to be more creative, to take more wiser action and accomplish more in your life, as well as to really be capable of enjoying a deep intimacy in your marriage. So what I've wanted to do in this episode is invite you to think about two common modes, archetypes that block disconnection. The one of being a bit of a child in your relationship. In fact, it reminds me, it's actually kind of a common thing that women sometimes refer to having, if they have 2 children, they'll refer to having 3 children because the husband is an additional child in the marriage in terms of reminding him to clean up his stuff and all that sort of thing. That's gross. You don't want to encourage that archetype because it blocks what is available to the two of you. Similarly, being a project manager also blocks connection, even though it seems efficient in getting things done. So instead, I invite you to lean in to being with one another, to drop the doing and allow being to strengthen in your marriage. And that is my response to what is connection, at least a part of my response. And I guess one more thing I want to add is that conceptually, I've spoken about being and doing as 2 distinct modes, like you're doing one or you're doing the other. And in reality, that does not need to be the case at all. So what makes for a really connected, nourishing, profound intimacy is having your being infuse your doing. So whether you're taking a walk, problem solving, making love, or just sitting on your back porch listening to the birds sing, that connection is present because you are embodying being while doing all the things you do.